Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Tuesday, July 15th, 2025, episode 438, Make Racism Great Again. This is actually not my title. One of the things that I wanted to do was to comment on uh, sort of theoretically adjacent people in the community, just to sort of I don't know, bring a little bit more clarity to some of the things that I'm saying, and also to see if I can make a contribution to the discussion, even though they probably will never know that I'm making comments on their stuff, which is okay. This is more, as I said, I'm doing this with the attitude that I'm talking to my kids, that maybe one day either they or their kids will listen to this stuff and maybe learn something, right? So I can speak to them from the grave. But I do want to say I'm kind of an odd duck, mostly because of the way that I was academically trained, and also because of my background, my childhood, which I've shared little bits and pieces. And my childhood, of course, includes my father, who was a huge influence on me, who did his did his PhD on the philosophy of religion. I did my PhD, same school, same department, on race theory mostly. And so, because of that background, I believe, and also because I was in ministry, uh, my father started one of the first churches in this Korean churches in the area. And then I grew up in that church. I saw all the politics. I saw everything that was going on. I saw the identity stuff. And when I went to seminary, that's when a lot of people started wrestling with racial issues. The seminary where I went, I was one of the first two American-born Korean students at that school. And so it was a very interesting dynamic, right? All the other Korean students that were there, English was their second language. And whereas for me, that's, people laughed at the way that I spoke in Korean. So that was, so all of these things going on, which contributed to probably an unusual, different perspective on most things, including at school, in the academic world. Of course, I was completely different, refused to toe the line, and that pushed me out on the edge. And then also within the church, I refused to play the politics. And so therefore, I get pushed out on the edge as well. So I've been meaning to listen to the entire episode of Make Racism Great Again, put out by the Libertarian Christian Institute, for whom I sometimes write, or I stopped writing for them. But anyway, but Jacob Winograd and Cody Cook were discussing identity politics in the liberty movement. And there were a couple of things that they discussed, which I thought, oh, well, that's not really that difficult, right? So, in other words, I thought that, if you have a clearer starting point, and if you are clear in terms of what you want to achieve, then it's obvious why you struggled with the things that you struggle with. And I've talked about this before in other episodes, and perhaps as a political movement, it's a non-starter. Right. You can't put a political movement together this way. However, as a society, perhaps you could. Okay. And it's come up before with the whole Elon Musk. What's a libertarian? What's wrong with the Libertarian Party? Et cetera, et cetera. So if you've been listening from the very beginning, or if you've listened for a certain amount of time, then you'll pick up some of the themes. So I'm going to highlight some of the things that they discussed in their episode, and then put in my 2 cents. It was a long episode, and there were lots of other things that I could discuss, but I think I would try to focus it on these racial themes that keep coming up. And so the struggle that Winograd was having was that the Liberty Movement and the Christian Church in the Liberty Movement is at a kind of crossroads. At least that's the way he sees it. Questions about dealing with the world as he wants it, and questions about the world as it is. And so he's all about the liberty concepts like self-ownership, private property, all this other kind of stuff, freedom, free market. But there's this tribalism and a fragmented society, parts of which hate liberty, and might even be anti-Christian. And I thought it was interesting when he said, especially when you quote scripture to them, which I never do in public space. But and so I'm not surprised that he'll get an anti-Christian blowback as a result of doing that. And so his question is the liberty movement unraveling? And that's kind of interesting, right? Because it does depends on your perspective on what the liberty movement is. I believe I'm part of the liberty movement, but I do it my own way. And so, especially in the face of the what seems to be the American foreign policy, which is, or American foreign and domestic policy, which is bomb the world and invite the world, right? So bomb them, they have no place to live, and so then they come here to live. But and that gives rise to all these other issues like immigration, which then leads to the tribalism that he seems to be wrestling with. Okay, so right away, I have to ask, what's so bad about racism, right? And so, as you should already know if you're following this channel, is that all race is a generalization based on a single characteristic, right? So you can do skin color if you want, but you can do religion, you can do ethnicity, you can do hometown, height, weight, gender, it doesn't really matter. But we racialize each other all of the time. I racialize my children as my children. I treat them a certain way because they're my children. I have certain expectations of them because they're my children. That makes me a racist. However, we don't call it racism. We call it good parenting, right? Responsible parenting. And so racism, when you're going to say it's bad, well, good parenting is not bad. That's not what you meant. What you are imagining are certain examples of discrimination, which you consider bad, right? And so therefore unacceptable. And so therefore it's a problem. We have to do something about it. Well, if good parenting is fine and encouraged, then we should not touch any racism, right? So any kind of ill feeling towards a group of people, well, you can't legislate against it. People have those attitudes because of what's going on in society. So you can't just simply say, yeah, that's bad. You shouldn't think that way any longer because it doesn't make sense to the person who has those feelings. It's based on their personal experience, rightly or wrongly. It doesn't really matter, right? And so, sort of legislating it or just demonizing it or just saying it's bad right offhand is probably not the best way to approach the topic because people get defensive. I know I taught race theory for over 20 years, and so yeah, I know what I'm talking about, right? If you confront someone and you are openly hostile to whatever attitude they have, instantly their defense mechanism kicks in and you have an argument instead of a discussion. All right. So instead of picking out certain perspectives on race as the only ones that are bad, well, instead of doing that, because once you do that, then now you're prescribing behavior, saying this is right, that's wrong. No one wants that. And so you got to pick a different way of starting. So you can say, yes, there's tribalism within the liberty movement. What's going on here, right? How do we better understand this? And then they quote a speech from Jeff Deist. They say that many people in the West still care about blood and soil, family, nation, not because of racism, but because these things matter to people, and so you can't ignore it. Uh, I don't think I read this speech by Jeff Deist, but I've heard him say similar things in different contexts. And, excuse me, quite frankly, I really do like everything that I've heard from Jeff Deist, and it's hard for me to disagree. And even if I don't repeat what he says, I see where he's coming from, right? And that's what I'm all about. I try to understand why someone says the things that they say, and I understand where Jeff Deist is coming from, and so therefore it makes sense to me. Okay, so when he talks about blood and soil, I think he's saying that people value things differently. So even being a Christian and then a libertarian is like privileging certain aspects of culture over others. And so you're not just simply a Christian, you're a Christian libertarian or a libertarian Christian, whatever, however you want to order those adjectives, those descriptives, it's different, right? It's, in other words, if you were to say libertarian and that means Christian, okay, but these are two totally different racializations. And by combining it, now you are taking, it's like a Venn diagram, right? So here you have the group that call themselves Christians, and then over here you have a group of people call themselves libertarians, and there is an overlap. And those people who are in both are either libertarian Christians or Christian libertarians, whatever. They're different, right? So those people who are in that intersection of those two racializations, they're different from everybody else who call themselves Christians or libertarians, right? And so by calling that out, by self-identifying as a Christian libertarian, you have already defined your ideal society differently than those other two larger parent groups. Okay. And so to assume that your vision of what society may or may not be, and even within the umbrella of Christian libertarians, there are many, many different visions of what an ideal society might look like, right? And so you can't assume that there is one ideal image. And I'm not saying that he is assuming that that is the case, but it does sure sound that way, that there is some goal that maybe we should be moving towards in this world of time and space, which would be ideal for all Christian libertarians. Okay. And it kind of reminds me of my time in seminary, right? So, like I said, I was one of the first American-born Korean students at my seminary. And so we're talking about going way back, right? But when I was there, people always assumed the white, that is, North American interpretation of scripture and application. In other words, what is moral? What is the right way to do church, to be Christian, right? Always had this implication, right? An implied whiteness to it, right? And to deviate from that was sin, right? It was wrong, right? To basically, it was wrong. And I remember I went to hear this guy who was the son of a famous dude. I'm forgetting exactly who it was, but he was the son of a famous missionary to Korea. And so, I think he married a Korean woman. He's white, and he married a Korean woman, and so he spoke Korean fluently. I mean, it was much better than my Korean for sure. Still had that North American accent, but he spoke really, really well, right? And I remember he had an opportunity to meet with the leader of North Korea. And I can't remember if it was I think it wasn't Kim Song-il. I think it was the grandfather of the person who is currently the dictator of North Korea. I think. And so the Korean church leaders of the city where I live, they invited him to give a talk to talk about his time with the leader of North Korea. And that's what everyone wanted to hear. That I was curious. I even went. I never go to these things, right? And all he did, all right, he was invited specifically to talk about what he talked about with that leader from North Korea. And all he did was use that as a platform to bash Koreans, right? Eating Korean food is sin. Speaking the Korean language is sin. That's all he did for an hour. It was insane, right? And so at one point, someone got up and said, "Well, we invited you here to talk about your conversation you had in North Korea. Are we going to talk about that?" And he goes, "Well, you guys keep eating kimchi, so you guys are in sin, right?" And so there's nothing else to talk about. And I thought that was bonkers, right? And I thought this guy is nuts, right? And he's supposed to be some representative of Christian churches in America. I don't know. It was weird, right? But wasn't surprised because that's pretty much what I got when I was in seminary, right? Maybe not that overt or over the top, but there was that thing where, hey, if you want to practice Christianity right, you got to do it this way. So there was always this assumption of doing it the right way, right? And melting pot was a concept. So melting pot came up in Cody Cook, I think, was bringing it up several times. Melting pot, if you study race theory, melting pot was an idea that was floated in the early 60s and then dropped, right? No, everyone's like, okay, there's no such thing as a melting pot. And I guess it's coming back, like assimilation is coming back. These are all, in race theory terminology, would be called racist ideas, okay? Because melting to what norm, right? So that's the idea. So we're all going to melt and become an amalgam, but we're all going to act white. See, that's the kind of the weird assumption behind the melting pot and assimilation, right? And assimilation, keep in mind, was originally coined only for white people, right? For Europeans. So blacks, they were never asked to assimilate, right? And certainly not Asians nor Native Americans, okay? So melting, the assimilation project was for white people, okay? Or people who would pass as white, okay? And so these ideas are really kind of like, huh? What are you talking about melting pot for? Okay, whatever. Unless he's just saying we're all going to get along together. But for me, who studied this stuff, melting pot is just kind of an irksome idea. It's like, okay, whatever. So how are you going to define melting pot and what are we all going to become? Is there a vision? Is there an idea of what you have that we're all supposed to, how we're all supposed to behave, what we're all supposed to look like? It's kind of weird. So I don't like using that concept, right? And can the liberty movement survive tribalism? Well, so closing my thoughts on what their critique of Jeff Deist, I think what he's saying is it's not so simple as to say, yeah, we all should become white Americans or some have some kind of idealized white culture behavior, right? And even if they're not saying that, what you have to recognize is that everyone is going to be different. And he even talked about it, right? In Alabama, the peanut farmer in Georgia versus the, uh, coffee shop owner in Oregon or whatever. Yeah, they're going to be different. Okay. And yet they're both American. And but there's very little that actually unifies them so physically and culturally. So what is it that makes them all American? And I'll just say it now. It's the idea of being independent, working hard, and being self-sustaining. That's it. That to me is what it means to be an American, right? You don't even have to speak English. I know that's going to bother some people, but uh, if you put that as a line, like, oh, you have to learn how to speak English fluently. Well, there are a lot of people, okay, who can't speak English fluently, okay, who have been living here for a long time, including my mom, okay. She's lived here longer than she's lived in Korea. And, what? Is she not American? No, excuse you, okay? That's not the line, right? You draw the line at someone who is going to work hard, be independent, right? That's it, right? Work hard, be independent. So you're not on welfare, you're not mooching off of anybody, but you are independent and you work hard, which means you're contributing to society. So by that definition, right? Uh, how you are going to create tribalism, it's totally up to you. And the next question that they, right, so melting pot, well, my mom is still alive, right? She's 92 now. Okay, so are you saying that she's not part of America? She's not part of Christianity? That's weird. This is just a totally weird conversation to have. But I speak Korean with her, right? What is that? We follow a lot of the Korean social norms because that is what she's most comfortable with. I, in fact, also am most comfortable with a lot of those things, like a lot of American habits, white people habits, black people habits, they bother me. But what am I going to say? Oh, you're not following the norm. No, it's just the way they are going to roll. I don't critique the way they live, and they're not going to critique the way that I live, right? And so, and if they did try to do that, I'll just point the finger right back at them. So now you're beginning to see, is tribalism really an issue that people want to make it out to be? So can the liberty movement survive tribalism, open borders? And, do we have to come back to small nations? And then how does faith figure into all of this stuff? And Cody Cook responded to him by saying, well, really what you're asking is how big is libertarianism? Okay, there was no Christian there, right? So libertarianism itself. So I've said before, all libertarianism is freedom with responsibility, period. That you don't put anything else on it, right? That's libertarianism. So you practice your freedom, you practice your life in the way that you want. However, all the consequences are yours. And that's why I insert the responsibility part of it, right? Because people just forget about that all the time. But when you talk freedom, there's always responsibility as well. But, so many people have bastardized that concept that you have to insert it there because people don't think that far. Anyway, so to emphasize other things, other aspects of libertarianism, like private property or a right to work, as soon as you add something to it, not you've lost a lot of people, right? People are not interested in that, or that's not where they're going to establish their stand. Okay. So redefining libertarianism along culture war and identity politics, well, of course, now that is only a subset of this big tent of libertarianism, right? Not everyone cares about the culture stuff. Not everyone cares about the identity politics. And so you may be free within the libertarian umbrella to pursue those things on your own, but as the movement as a whole, it cannot be part of it, right? Because most people are not interested in that. And so when half jokingly, Cody Cook says, should we let racists start a community? Well, yeah, everything is racist, right? So think of it, the Young Women's Christian Association, YWCA, or the Young Men's Christian Association, YMCA. Yeah, those are racist communities, right? Because they're Christian and men and young. Okay. So basically, whenever you sort of focus on a certain group, you are being racist. And so, to what is the difference between saying a Young Men Christians Association, the YMCA, versus white supremacy group, right? White Workers Association. I mean, it's no different at all. They are voluntary communities, and so they have a right to exist. Now, as soon as they cross the line and do violence, commit crime against other people's property, well, then now we have a problem. But otherwise, who really cares? Right. And honestly, if we were living in, I mean, because if you're going to go that far, if you're going to say, well, should they have a right to exist? Then you're talking about a totally free society. In a totally free society, no one will care. And a racist group like that will live or die as long as the people who subscribe to that uh, belief are still alive. But as soon as they die out, it's done. Okay. And so people really don't need to have to take a strong position on anything. And even if you did, it's a personal thing, right? So even nationalism, protectionism, all this stuff. Like Jacob Winograd is torn because he wants freedom, but he also wants to evangelize. And see, I would say that's the problem. He has the freedom starting point. Okay, fine. And then now he changes the direction, right? He makes the direction towards evangelizing for Christianity. That's fine. He can do that, but he has to realize that 95% of the people will not follow him down that path, right? 5% is okay, but then the rest of us probably will not want to follow him that way. And I've always said that in the classroom. I told everyone I was a Christian, and people can take it or leave it, right? But people who wanted to ask me about it, they found me after class and we talked about it, right? But in the open conversation, if you are doing a political movement, yeah, you don't talk about that in the open. You don't make that the main point of discussion. It's always a voluntary thing. And I've, never had to quote scripture in class or anything that situation, but people always came to me afterwards and told me they wanted to know more about this Christian libertarian thing that I keep talking about. Okay. And that's what you want. You want people to ask you, by your example, by the kind of life that you live, you want other people to approach you. You're never shoving it into other people's faces. At least that's the way I look at it. And that is more consistent with the ideas of freedom. So, how do we get to the place where there's less violence and more peace? You leave people alone. You say, okay, freedom, you're in for freedom. You're down for freedom with responsibility. I am too. That's it, right? That's your conversation. And then if you talk more, you say, well, how do you do things this way? What do you do about this? Now you have a conversation, but it's after the fact, right? Once you've established that point in commonality that is freedom, then there's nothing more to discuss within that framework of freedom. Now you're like, well, how are you practicing your freedom? How are you practicing your freedom? But that is an individual conversation, right? You're talking about a personal choice. And so he talked about it, Winograd, he said, well, step one is freedom, and then no step two, right? Step one is, okay, we're all for freedom, and then there's no step two. Or if you do have a step two, then you have mixed results. Well, yeah, because freedom is what everyone wants, but freedom their way. And so when you try to say, no, but freedom has to be practiced this way as a Christian, well, yeah, you lose everyone, okay? And because even in Christianity, no one agrees. So is step two the problem? Well, that's the thing, right? And I'll get to that in terms of starting point. Running out of time, so I'm going to try to go faster. Wrap it up a little bit here, right? So I'll just close it on that point, right? So I think the problem that he has is this idea of what do we do? Okay, so here we have freedom, and then what's the step two? And as soon as you try to get to step two, like, okay, we're going to fight for pro-life. Well, not everyone's down with that, right? So even something as basic as pro-life, you're not going to have everyone on board with that. So every step two becomes problematic, and that's why you're going to have mixed results. So my easy solution is not what is the ideal society looking like? No, I start with now, right? We have too much government. Look, if we can just like defund half of government, okay, make that the goal. And as the regulatory state is reduced and you see more freedom, now people are going to use that freedom to come up with solutions, right? To say solutions have to go in this direction. Yeah, that's you've lost it, right? And so you don't need to articulate a step two. All you have to do is your step one is reduce government, right? Defund government, defund politicians, end the Fed, whatever. Your goal is to get rid of the source of 99% of our problems. Your goal is to get rid of the deep state that always wants war. Your goal is to get rid of that censoring, privileging, banning, canceling entity that's part of the deep state, right? You don't want that, right? What you want is freedom. And there is so much to do on that end, right? That I don't think we'll ever be will live long enough to be able to see a society where the state is ended, barring economic catastrophe. Right. So I'm just going to leave it there. And maybe I'll look at my notes, and if there's more, I'll put it in a part two. But see that I think that's the issue. Once you start crystallizing your vision of what your perfect society is, yeah, now you're going to have disagreement. It's going to fall apart because everyone wants their own vision. So I don't think the focus should be there. I think the focus should be on bringing down the state, reducing the state, which is why Jeff Deist talks about decentralization. Okay, so that's how I'm going to end this episode. Hope you were hanging with me the whole time. And if you feel strongly one way or the other, like don't do this again ever, leave me a comment or send me a message, send me an email, subjectiveprofessor@gmail.com. And I will talk to you next time.